Hey, everybody. All right, for everyone jumping in, we're going to get started in about 1 minute. Thanks, everyone, for joining for tonight's Executive Council District 2 Primary Forum. Super excited to have you all with us this evening.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having us, Isaac.
Thank you. Yeah, excited to have you. So while we're waiting for everyone to come on, just very quick Zoom 101. If you have a comment or a question you'd like to ask, you can put it in the chat, which if you don't see your chat, make sure you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and you'll click where it says chat, and then it will come up on the right side of your screen. We will be keeping everyone muted except for the candidates when they're speaking. And other than that, if you have a question about Zoom or any technical difficulties, just please post it in the chat and I'll do what I can to help you out. So we'll get started in about 30 seconds. Got a couple more people just coming in right now. All right, Asma, whenever you're ready, go ahead and kick us off.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Hello, everyone. My name is Asma El-Huni, and I am the Movement Politics Director for Rights and Democracy New Hampshire. I want to thank, first of all the candidates for joining us tonight, and all of you who've joined in to listen and to learn more about them and their campaigns. So a little bit about Rights and Democracy before we begin. Rights and Democracy is a member-led people's organization, and it's member-led through chapters in both Vermont and New Hampshire. And our mission is to basically shift the political landscape through both electoral and also community organizing to ensure we're centering the values and needs of our communities and make sure that that's what guides our policies in government. And we do this by basically creating a popular movement that advances human rights and dismantles racism and sexism and economic injustice and classism, and then builds a more equitable society and economy. And we do that through the foundation of our mission statement, which is collective liberation. A little bit about our New Hampshire People's Platform. The New Hampshire People's Platform basically centers healthcare for all, a just transition to 100% renewable energy, a livable minimum wage for everyone, an equitable and fair public education funding, among other issues that we support and work on in solidarity with other leaders in the state of New Hampshire. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our Rights and Democracy Leadership Committee member, Andrea, let me make sure I say her last name right, Palizas, yes, who will be moderating the forum. Andrea is a retired middle school science teacher, a founding member of the Monadnock Progressive Alliance, and a member of the MPA's leadership team and Harrisville Community Action Group. Andrea?
Thank you, Asma. With us today are the 4 candidates in the Executive Council District 2 Democratic primary who have requested endorsement from Rights and Democracy. We have a lot of candidates here tonight, so we will move quickly through the forum to pose as many questions as possible. Each candidate will be given 3 minutes to introduce themselves and explain why they are running. And then they will be asked to answer 4 prepared questions, followed by questions from the audience. For the prepared questions, candidates will have up to 90 seconds to answer each. We will rotate alphabetically with who we start with for each question, and I will be moderating and keeping time. As a reminder to everyone here with us on Zoom, you are invited to submit your questions in the chat bar at any point throughout the forum. And after the prepared questions, we will have time to bring forward questions from our audience. Before we start the questions, I'd like to give a brief interview of the candidates who we will be hearing from tonight. And we will start with Cindy Warmington. Cindy has spent her life working for the recognition of health care as a basic human right. She has 40 years of professional experience in healthcare, 20 years in laboratory medicine and hospitals, and 20 as a healthcare attorney. Cindy has also spent 20 years working to elect Democrats, serving as a town committee chair, county officer, and currently as chair of the New Hampshire Democratic Party's platform committee. As a healthcare worker and now a healthcare attorney, Cindy has seen the challenges that many Granite Staters face in accessing quality, affordable healthcare, including mental health and substance use disorder treatment. The Executive Council serves a critical role in healthcare funding, and she would want to work in that role to expand access and lower costs for New Hampshire families. Next will be Craig Thompson. Craig first came to New Hampshire over 30 years ago to study at Plymouth State College. Between working on a farm, waiting tables, washing dishes, and starting college, he fell in love with the Granite State. While his education and career took him elsewhere over the years, as a horse trainer, farmer, and writer, he always knew he'd be back. Over 8 years ago, Craig's family settled in New Hampshire and bought Mayfair Farm in Harrisville, which at the time was no more than a shell of the busy dairy farm that it once was. It is now a flourishing business, one that pays its employees a living wage, and has also been named a New Hampshire Farm of Distinction. Craig has also served as a state representative representing Cheshire's 14th district for the past 2 years, serving on the State Federal Relations and Veterans Affairs, and authoring an ambitious bill to create a climate action plan for New Hampshire. He has also volunteered on the Harrisville Planning Board, the board of the Monadnock Food Co-op, and the New Hampshire Farm Bureau Legislative Affairs Committee. Next, I'll introduce Emmett Soldati. Emmett was born and raised in New Hampshire's smallest city. Emmett Soldati is an entrepreneur, activist, and local provocateur. He ran for city council at the age of 22 and lost. So he opened a cafe, Teetotaler, to create vibrancy in his one road downtown, only 1 block away from his childhood lemonade stand. His cafe blossomed into a hub of LGBTQ+ activity and community. In 2019, he was named New Hampshire's Young Entrepreneur of the Year, in part for his commitment to building a business that estimates its worth based on its social values and support of its workers. He is a foster parent, an immigrant rights activist, and as the chair of the Somersworth Democrats, helped transform the city's council and school board to be more diverse, younger, and progressive. And next is Leah Plunkett. Leah was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She was a Klemenko Fellow and Lecturer on Law at Harvard Law School, where her research focused on the intersections of consumer law and access to justice. She is now a lawyer and associate professor of legal skills, the mother of 2, and an associate dean at the University of New Hampshire's Franklin Pierce Law School. Leah has served on the board of Planned Parenthood of Northern New England, as well as the board of the New Hampshire chapter of the ACLU. She is also a member of NEA New Hampshire. So we'll now start with up to 3 minutes for each candidate to introduce themselves and answer the question, why are you running for executive council? And what unique experience and skills would you bring to the council? So you have 3 minutes, and I have a timer set for 2.5. So it's going to ding on you when you have 30 seconds left. So you can just keep talking right through the ding, and I won't let it go too long. We will start with Cindy Warmington. We'll be followed in order by Craig Thompson, and then Emmett Soldati, and then Leah Plunkett. So Cindy, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you all for hosting this. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I am running for executive council because everything is at stake in this election. I have been working as a Democratic activist for more than 20 years, and I have been telling people for the last 3 elections that this is the most important election of our lifetime, and it's been true every time. And I believe that this election is going to be about Democrats standing up and coming together and saying who we are and what we believe in, and this is the role that I can play to help the most. Each one of us needs to stand up, and that's why I'm running. Everything, when I say everything is on the line, the right to vote, the right to choose, the right to marry the one you love, healthcare, education, climate, voting rights, workers' rights, it's all on the line in this election. And that's why I'm stepping up. And I have a vision for the Executive Council, that we would expand the power of the Executive Council, in part by we would get into agencies earlier and start asking questions before contracts come to the Executive Council. Right now, contracts come to the Executive Council on Friday night and get voted on Wednesday mornings. And that just isn't enough time to really impact the values that we are trying to forward. So I see getting into agencies earlier. I see expanding the role of the Democratic caucus. I see more integration with the legislature. So a really transformational role in the Executive Council. And as mentioned in the introduction, and thank you, Andrea, for that, I have 40 years of healthcare experience. I'm a healthcare attorney. I read, write, and negotiate contracts for a living. So I often tell people, to be an executive counselor, you need somebody who's just geeky enough to enjoy reading contracts while also personable enough to articulate our values. And I believe I bring those skills. I have, as I said, 40 years of healthcare experience. I started out as a phlebotomist, drawing blood at my local hospital to put myself through college. I was the first one in my family to ever go to college. And after that, I worked, my first job in New Hampshire was at Lakes Region General Hospital in the lab. I was a laboratory technologist, a blood bank supervisor. I became a laboratory manager, and later a hospital business office manager. And I have also volunteered my time in mental health. Am I at 30? I have 30 seconds. I chair the board of my local mental health center, and I now sit on the board of Riverbend. I've had a lifelong commitment to healthcare for all, a grassroots activist. I respect the work that Rights and Democracy does, because I also am somebody who understands that we change the world one vote at a time by knocking on doors. And I thank you for this opportunity to be here today with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, and Craig. Whoops, sorry, this is a different, okay. Ah! Craig?
Yes, you all set there?
It's
Anna?
your turn, my friend, yes.
Okay.
Whoops, sorry, can't get stop.
I'll wait, I'm good. Okay. We ready to go? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you so much for all of you for being here this evening. You know, I suppose I should begin with the fact that I'm running in this race as a Democrat because we don't have a viable progressive party. If we did, I'd run for that party's nomination. But I entered the race because, well, for several reasons. One, I think that there's room in this race for someone who's not a lawyer or a lobbyist. I'm a farmer. I think there's room in this race for someone who isn't from Concord. I live in a small town in the Monadnock region. I think there's room in this race for someone with real experience. And I'm the only candidate who's actually worked in the legislature, tackled the hard issues, and proposed creative solutions. But really, when we get down to it, there are two issues that motivate me. The first is the need to increase wages. You know, we just saw the governor once again veto a minimum wage bill, but really we need to set our sights on a living wage. And we can do that from the Executive Council. We can use the Executive Council in new and creative ways. You know, if we approach the approval that the council grants to every state contract over $10,000, if we approach that from the perspective of making sure that those businesses that want to enter contracts with the state are paying their employees well, we can start to put upward pressure on wages, and we can make sure that those companies that are doing business with the state are part of the solution, not the problem. The second issue is climate change, or more accurately, the climate crisis. As a farmer, I see the climate crisis every day. For many people, it's something they see in the news. It's bushfires in Australia or the threat of rising sea level, but for me, I deal with new pests in our orchards. I deal with increased extreme rainfall events and extreme temperature variations throughout the year. These are all the hallmarks of climate change, and they're happening now. I grapple with them every day. So, you know, what we've been doing to try to get government to address the crisis isn't working, which is why the opportunity to address it from the Executive Council is so important. From the Executive Council, I'll have a litmus test for every gubernatorial nominee who comes before the council. I'll ask, do you believe in climate change? If they don't, they won't get my support. If they do, my follow-up question will be, then what are you going to do about it from your role within the state government? When we do this, we can start to move the state in the right direction. And it shouldn't go unnoticed that the single biggest, most influential board in state government is the Public Utilities Commission. I actually wrote legislation to try to redefine the PUC to make sure that it would take into account the costs of climate change, not just the costs of energy. The commissioners who sit on the PUC are approved by the Executive Council. Every one of them is going to have to answer to me, what do you believe in climate change? And if they don't, they won't get my support. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you all for being here this evening. I look forward to everybody's questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. And we're going to now turn to Emmett Soldati.
Thank you, Andrea. So I became a RAD member a little over 2 years ago because I felt in New Hampshire that the progressive topic was too much of a banner without substance. And too often it felt like a moment without much of a movement behind it. And I think in part that reason was, for too often, the policies that are meant to support folks, whether it's underrepresented people that are working many jobs that are minimum wage jobs, folks that are in recovery with a substance use disorder, these are people that have been kept out of state government. And I think the inequality of our state government, the inequality of our revenue structure keeps these folks out of power. And I'm running to change that. You know, when I told my community in Somersworth that I was running for Executive Council, they were inspired because they saw the work that we did to transform our community, to connect neighbors around shared values. And they recognized that Somersworth is not unique or alone in the communities in New Hampshire that can do that. But when folks in our state house or folks in the Capitol caught wind of my candidacy, they told me that I was too young, too inexperienced, and too busy to be able to serve as executive counselor. And I think we need to stop shutting the door on people that come from property poor communities, or else progressive doesn't mean anything. You know, I may be young, but I was proud to be the Young Entrepreneur of the Year, in part for building a business that was measured not by the way the last generation measured success, but by measuring how our employees and how the people that interact with the business succeed and survive. You know, I may be told that I don't have the right experience, but when I took on Facebook pro se in our state Supreme Court and won, I was the only person in the country to have ever done that. And it shows that I'm willing to hold big tech accountable, but also that I know how to read the fine print. And there are many progressive leaders throughout the state that thinks that's the exact kind of experience we need on our executive council. And people may say that I'm too busy, but I'm tired of this line being used to block people out of the political process, people that are working poor, people that are in recovery, people that are working 2 or 3 jobs. You know, I am proud of brandishing a megaphone at the Stratford Immigration Detention Center calling for the defunding of ICE. I am proud to set up events in my cafe that supports the legalization of cannabis. But the activist class can't be locked out of the political movement. And I think it's important that we have those values expressed on our executive council as well. I'm running because it isn't that we can't trust that a Democrat will get elected to this seat. It's that communities like ours that have been busy and struggling and bruised by a political system have been kept out. And we can't trust that someone with experiences like ours and communities like ours can get elected. I'm the only candidate running that is on unemployment. And so if you want a candidate that understands what it's like for the tens of thousands of Granite Staters that had to wait to figure out how they were going to pay their bills because of a broken legacy unemployment system, then I will be vetting the people that we lead the employment security system in New Hampshire. I'm the only candidate running that doesn't have health insurance. And so if you want a candidate that will vet the Department of Health and Human Services appointments from the perspective of the have-nots, I would encourage you to get involved in our campaign. I'm a lifelong townie that has been looking at New Hampshire from the outside in for too long. And it's time that we bring in the marginalized voices to build a better New Hampshire for our next generation.
Thank you, Emmett. Our next, last but not least, we have Leah Plunkett. Leah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here tonight. My name is Leah Plunkett, and I'm running for Executive Council here in District 2 because our state is at a crossroads. And we have the opportunity to fill this crucial seat with a courageous, proven leader, someone who has been fighting for a stronger, socially just New Hampshire ever since I moved here to start a family with my husband 13 years ago. As you shared in my intro, I was born and raised in Michigan. My husband and his family grew up here on the Seacoast and going back a couple of generations. And we came here to have 2 kids now and a dog and now a hamster. Actually, I somehow got talked into a hamster during a pandemic life. And I am so proud to be sticking up for my kids, ages 5 and 9. One is a student in our public schools. The other's due to start there in the fall. I stick up for them and my niece and my nephew every single day. And I want to be on the Executive Council to do that for kids and families across the Granite State. So I'm a full-time working mom. I'm a law professor. I'm a recent first-time author. I wrote a book on big tech and kids' privacy. So Emmett, hat off to you for Facebook. Well done. And I am an associate dean also at UNH Law here in Concord. And I've been fighting for social justice in New Hampshire ever since I moved here. Before I taught law, when I was in legal practice, I was a legal aid lawyer and a consumer rights lawyer. I got my start at New Hampshire Legal Assistance. I founded a project called the Youth Law Project that still exists that provides representation for at-risk kids and teenagers. I represented clients with disabilities, mostly mental health disabilities, but also some physical disabilities, to get them the special education and related services they were legally entitled to. Then, after seeing what the Great Recession was doing to everyone in my client base and everyone in the state and everyone in the country, I joined the National Consumer Law Center for a couple of years and did policy work to promote economic justice. Also, since 2008, I have served on some of the boards of leading nonprofits here in New Hampshire. As was mentioned in the intro, I was a trustee for Planned Parenthood of Northern New England for 6 years. So that's the organization that does the health centers in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. And then when I got term limited off that board, I couldn't get enough Planned Parenthood, so I hopped over to the Planned Parenthood New Hampshire Action Fund side. And I was chairing that board when I decided to step down and run for this seat. And my Planned Parenthood service is a huge reason I stepped forward to run. In 2011, when we lost our state funding at the health centers, as a lawyer, my first reaction was, what's the appeal process? And that's when I was told there was no appeal from an executive council spending decision. The only solution was at the ballot box. So we found a new executive counselor for that seat and got our funding back. Last summer, when Sununu brought forward Attorney General Gordon MacDonald to be the next state Supreme Court Chief Justice, I knew I had to act. So I spoke up loudly and proudly against Gordon MacDonald's nomination. And I am proud to be continuing speaking up loudly and proudly on the campaign trail, and I will as your counselor too.
Thank you, Leah. We will start with Craig Thompson for this next question, and we'll rotate first responses for the remainder of our questions tonight. Candidates will have 1 to 2 minutes each to answer the prepared questions. I will ding the bell with 20 seconds left this time. And so question 1, we'll start. Craig, I hope you're ready. One of the main roles of the Executive Council is to scrutinize all spending above $10,000 and to vote up or down on the huge number of contracts that the state enters into. what criteria will you use to evaluate contract approval, and how will you prioritize those criteria? We'll start with Craig, then Emmett, then Leah, then Cindy. Okay,
Thank you.
Craig, you're ready.
Thank you, Andrea. You know, this seems like it could be a complicated or deep question requiring a multifaceted answer, but it's not. It's a simple answer. We have to ask those businesses, are you paying your employees a living wage? Not a $12 or a $15 minimum wage, but an actual real living wage, which is north of 20 bucks an hour. Last I looked, it was $23, $26 an hour in New Hampshire. It's as simple as that. And there's no point in the state pursuing business with companies whose employees are then turning to the state for assistance. The second part of that we have to look at is, how are these businesses responding to the climate crisis? Is what they're doing adding to our problems or helping to resolve our problems? These two questions haven't been brought to bear in this process in the past, but I look forward to pursuing them. And to me, it's as simple as that. Thank you.
Over to me.
Thank you, Craig. And, yep, we'll go right on over to Emmett.
Yeah, so I would first agree with basically what is now known as sort of the Valinsky test, who started by asking any vendor that wants taxpayer dollars what they're paying, what the lowest wages that they're paying, and be able to vet through that lens. I would probably extend that process to also ask about executive pay, because I think the ratio really matters. We're essentially the fiscal agents of our state and of all of the taxpayers of how we're spending our money. And so it is important that we are both asking the organizations and the companies that want taxpayer dollars that they are providing for their workers, even the lowest paid workers within their company. But the ratio matters too, because we want to make sure that they're not just spending most of the money that's going to executives. It's important that money that you are all spending in your tax dollars are really going into hard work and to hard workers for our state. And I think the only thing to add in terms of vetting contracts is that it's not just about dollars and cents. A lot of times we actually put our values into who we choose to do business with. A perfect example is in 2017, there was an adoption contract that had real taxpayer dollars on the line. You mentioned in the opening, I'm a foster parent. It's obviously very important to me that all folks and youth have a loving and stable home. But when that contract was up, the money went to Bethany Christian Services. And that's a faith-based organization that denies same-sex couples the right to adopt, which means effectively the state is sanctioning a discriminatory practice of preventing same-sex couples from having full access to the adoption services that heterosexual couples in the state would have. And so I think as executive counselor, it's not just enough to look at the bottom line or the top line. We actually have to look at the organizations that will be conducting the business that we're paying them to do and make sure that they speak for the values of all Granite Staters.
Right over to me.
Thank you. Yes. No,
Thank
actually, it's Leah's turn.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. I couldn't hear either. So, don't worry about it. Zoom is always an adventure. So, I would be looking for a couple of key things. First, I would be looking for competent, trustworthy leadership and trustworthy practices within any organization that the state would be contracting with. I would be looking for a living wage. I would be looking for whether the contract would be creating jobs for underserved communities or providing resources to underserved communities. One of the biggest things that the Executive Council does in approving contracts is making sure that we have equity of access and inclusivity across the state. And I would be looking at any business that came before the council to see if it is supporting that or working against that. And last but not least, I would be looking to get to yes. I think that scrutinizing contracts can often lead to people saying no or finding problems. And of course, we need to stand firm on having trustworthy, competent leadership and trustworthy, competent organizations that are contracting with the state. But we also need to make sure that we are holding the line at having ways to get to yes and to come up with creative, inclusive solutions to the many problems in the state through how we spend our dollars.
Thank you very much. Okay, Cindy.
Thank you. So part of this question is, what are the criteria that we'll use? And I agree with the prior speakers that we can use the Executive Council to forward our values. But the problem with the Executive Council as it is functioning now is that, as I sat down with Andy Valinsky when I decided to run for office and talked to him about this and congratulated him on the great work that he has done in nominations and moving the Executive Council forward. But I asked him, how have you been able to move the dial on contracting? And he said, really, Cindy, it's just a little bit, because we get the contracts on Friday night, they're fully negotiated, it's an up or down vote, and we vote on Wednesday mornings. And I will tell you that this governor structures the agenda so that it's very hard for you to turn down a contract. Some disaster will befall our state if you turn down the contract, and that is not by accident. So I said to him, what if I can get into these agencies earlier and start asking that question about living wages, start asking those questions about whether they pay healthcare benefits, whether their workforce is diverse, whether the contractors represent a diverse representation of our population, if they're using clean technology. I think all of these questions, and it will depend on the contract, but we can forward our values in all of these areas if we get in 6-8 months in advance before the RFPs are issued and say what we want to see in the RFPs, and then also on the score sheet. Now, Andy pointed out this will be an ambitious task. I understand it. It's a transformational role for the Executive Council. I understand that. I am willing to commit that time to make sure we can really push the limits of the power of this Executive Council.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you on that. Our next question, we'll be starting with Emmett, and then Leah, and then Cindy, and then Craig. The question is about pardon requests. Pardon requests are often very political and controversial, and many counselors don't entertain any of them because of this. There are two decisions that executive counselors can make when considering granting a pardon request for someone who is imprisoned, sometimes for violent crimes. Number one, do you grant that person a hearing? And the second question, do you grant them a pardon? So the two-part question here is, your first question for you, what are your criteria for granting a hearing? The second question, if that hearing is granted, what are the things that you'd be looking for in considering a pardon? Now we have one more that's sort of our courage bonus here if you want to tackle this one. This is an optional one. If the pardon is considering someone who has committed a violent crime, how do you balance considering true rehabilitation of an inmate with honoring and respecting the victim of that person's crime? So we'll start with Emmett.
Thank you, Andrea. So I'll try to answer all three components in one. We have to recognize that we have a broken criminal justice system and that plenty of people have been caught up in it for both unjust laws and are treated unjustly while they're there. I spend a lot of my activism time focusing on releasing those that are held in the immigrant detention center. But I know, having been the son of the longest standing county attorney in our state, that even folks that are in the correctional facility in Stratford County or elsewhere in our state, not all of them need to be there, not all of them deserve to be there, and many of them have served their time. And if we believe in justice, we have to have checks and balances, because I don't think just going through the internal parole system always does justice. So a couple answers to your questions. First, in terms of hearing, I think if we ever recognize that there is a law that we have changed, recognizing that it was an unjust law and someone was incarcerated for that, not only do they deserve a hearing, they probably deserve a pardon. In particular, the legalization of drugs, including cannabis. I think when we recognize that we have locked people up and put them in basically terrible conditions in some cases, that they don't deserve to be there, and there are other people that are, whether privileged through class or privileged through race, aren't put into that. The second thing is we have to balance the rights of victims. I'm proud that my father built the Victims Witness Protocol that is the state standard for how we support victims of sexual violence and domestic violence. And we have to recognize that they have rights and they need to be able to continue to be safe and secure members of society. So when it comes to violent crimes, I think that is probably the heaviest weight that an executive counselor has to weigh. We do believe in a justice system. We do, if our judges set particular requirements, if people have gone through the process of demonstrating the rehabilitation, they deserve a hearing. But I don't think that that's a one size fits all. I can't imagine it being a one size fits all. At the end of the day, I think we over incarcerate. I'm happy to have always supported abolishing the death penalty. I think that we crowd our prisons and that we should never be looking for prisons as a solution to what are often public health problems. And so a lot of times the Executive Council can use its pardon power to recognize a past injustice, but that doesn't come at the expense of victims.
Thank you. Leah?
When I was a legal aid lawyer, I sometimes quite literally stood between my juvenile clients and school resource officers or other local law enforcement trying to arrest them for behaviors that were the result of mental health disabilities or domestic instability or other things that were really out of their control. So I feel very personally, in addition to professionally, committed to not using our criminal justice system in this state for folks of any age as a backdoor way to deal with mental health issues, to deal with substance use issues, or to perpetrate economic injustices. That's something else I studied quite a bit at National Consumer Law Center and have stood up for on the ACLU board, where I've chaired our Economic Justice Committee, which has worked on things like bail reform and other important ways to make sure that we're only using our criminal justice system to punish as appropriate and to ensure public safety as appropriate. So in pardons, I would be looking first and foremost to see if somebody had been incarcerated because of an impermissible, unethical use of the justice system. So if someone has been incarcerated because really what they needed was mental health services and they could not get them, and instead they acted out in such a way that there was some, disorderly conduct or other, de minimis offense that they could be incarcerated due to, I would use the pardon power to say, look, we're not going to use our criminal justice system and certainly not our jails and our prisons to deal with what are really public health issues. On the question of violent offenders, I think that we have an ethical responsibility to ensure public safety and to ensure respect for all of our citizens, and that includes survivors of violent crimes as well as perpetrators. I would be looking to see if there has been true rehabilitation, if there could be sustained rehabilitation, and to ensure that there was not an ongoing threat to any individual or public safety. Thank you.
Thank you. Cindy?
Thank you. I served on the board of my local mental health center for 8 years and chaired that board, and I now serve on the board of Riverbend, and I also served on the two substance use treatment boards. This is an issue really very near and dear to my heart, is that, as Leah mentioned, the criminal justice system is often a place where we, as a society, attempt to remedy a public health issue that should be resolved in the healthcare system. And it takes me back to why I'm advocating for healthcare for all, because so many of these issues, people would not end up in prison if they had had adequate healthcare. I would expand on the mental health issue to say substance abuse issues. Many people who are behind bars are really victims of substance abuse issues, and those people should not be imprisoned. And I would certainly look to any kind of situation where the person should never have been imprisoned in the first place. I also echo the concerns that if we have changed the laws, those people should certainly be released from prison. I would grant a hearing based on acceptance of responsibility on their rehabilitation, and those would be the criteria I would use for granting a pardon as well. It would obviously have to be balanced against the victim impact statements. We need our victims to be protected and to be safe in our society. So those are the criteria that I would use.
Thank you, Cindy. Craig?
Thank you. I'll start with the last part of your question. We don't diminish the rights of victims when we guarantee the rights of the convicted. That might not be a popular statement, but that's the reality. And I am pretty darn sure on this call, and I know in this race, I'm the only person here who's actually gone and met with those violent offenders, with the men and women in our state prisons who are incarcerated for 10, 20 years to life. I've done it repeatedly because part of our job as public servants is to tackle the hardest issues, which I've tried to do from the legislature. You know, I sponsored 2 criminal justice reform bills, 3 really. And, you know, one of them was actually written and given to me by residents of the men's prison in Concord. It would have just made one change to a sentence that would have allowed them to actually be released when they hit the 2/3 mark of their sentence, because that's what the law says they should be, but because of one little bit of unclear language, they don't get that opportunity. But, you know, this is also just part of a bigger issue. We know that when we demilitarize our police and reallocate those funds to social services and to actually funding our school systems, our prison population is going to go down. It's part of a bigger problem because we know that about 7% of our population is people of color, but about 11% of our prison population is people of color. Yet get this, of all the probation officers we have here in New Hampshire, none's black, not a single one, not a single person of color serving as a parole officer in New Hampshire. So it's a big issue. We need to tackle it. You know, I tried to tackle it through legislation by offering some simple solutions like educational opportunities in our prison system and an opportunity to actually earn a wage while in prison. Because, you know, according to the 13th Amendment, you don't even have to pay a prisoner for their labor. So I would be very generous in granting both pardon hearings and pardons. Thank you.
Thank you. Emmett, your turn.
I think I might have answered it.
No one first. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, question 3. One of the most important functions of the Executive Council is the responsibility to vote on judicial appointments. Our state Supreme Court in particular plays a very important role in decisions regarding our healthcare, worker and environmental protections, civil liberties, education funding, reproductive rights, voting rights, and more. Considering the fact that they are ethically supposed to avoid stating how they would vote on controversial issues likely to come before them, what criteria will you look for in a Supreme Court nominee? This time we will start with Leah, followed by Cindy, Craig, and then Emmett.
Thank you. I'm looking for a Supreme Court nominee who would uphold the Constitution, and that includes upholding the rights to reproductive freedom and other individual freedoms. I would also be looking for somebody who has a proven track record in our court system and is trustworthy and courageous. I was on the record very publicly, very boldly last summer, speaking up against Gordon MacDonald's nomination. Not everyone was my biggest fan when I did it. It's really hard to stand up publicly against dozens of others in your profession, including some of my colleagues, and speak out against the sitting Attorney General, someone that actually most people thought was going to be the next Chief Justice. And even if he wasn't, which he wasn't, he was still going to be the AG. That takes courage. And I showed that courage as Planned Parenthood New Hampshire Action Fund Chair last summer, and I've continued to show that courage on the campaign trail. And I think that it's really important for the next counselor in this seat to have a demonstrated track record of courage around standing up for a Supreme Court nominee, especially Chief Justice, who will fully protect reproductive freedom and other individual freedoms, as well as somebody who won't back down on the need to make this governor fully seat a co-equal branch of government. So I hope and expect we will not have 2 more years of Sununu, but especially if we do, the counselor in this anchor seat needs to be able to say, in collaboration with all the other folks, to make sure that we're not going to hurt anyone when we do it, but has to be able to say, you know what, Governor, we're shutting down the business of this state until you can get us a court nominee who is trustworthy, and who will protect the Constitution.
Thank you. And who is next?
I think I am.
Cindy.
I would certainly look at all of the qualifications of every judicial nomination. This is one of the most important functions of the Executive Council. It is critically important that we all understand that the balance of our Supreme Court is in jeopardy right now. We already have 2 members of that court that we believe would overturn our, would uphold an effort to undermine Roe v. Wade, or if Roe v. Wade is overturned in the Supreme Court level, would not support reproductive rights. And a 3rd seat would really endanger women in this state. So we need to have somebody on the Supreme Court who will protect our reproductive rights and our voting rights. So let's just, cut to the chase here. What we really are talking about is this governor is holding and has held open for a solid year the seat of the Chief Justice of our Supreme Court, because he wants Gordon MacDonald in that seat. And he is looking for his 3rd vote to put Gordon MacDonald in that seat. And truthfully, all of the people that are on this call, I believe, would not do that. But there is one candidate in this race who has been very public in his support for Gordon MacDonald on the Supreme Court. And that is an important fact that people need to know. I would not appoint anyone to the court who was not both competent and who was committed to upholding our fundamental rights.
Thank you. Craig?
Thank you. One of the fun things about doing this is you get to hear really how much so many of us are on the same page. We know that we need to protect reproductive rights, and that is at the top of the list. We also know that this current governor, hopefully he won't be in office this time next year, but this current governor really likes to appoint people who are just completely unqualified for the positions he's appointing them to. So experience matters. But I think I would go a step further in saying that before I made a decision, I would want to reach out to the population that has perhaps been most negatively affected by the flaws in our justice system. I'd pick up the phone and call the leaders of a Movement for Black Lives and BLM, and I would say, where do you guys stand on this? Because those are the people who need to have a voice at the table and haven't. Thank you.
Thank you. Emmett?
So as someone that recently defended myself in the Supreme Court and won, I recognize the reason that that was able to happen is that the justices, both appointed by Republicans, Democrats, had an understanding of the digital landscape. And it became clear to me how important it was to have justices that recognize that our digital rights are increasingly going to be litigated by corporate interests. And it is so valuable to have justices that can understand that Facebook is not simply a free website that people can use, but actually abuses and takes advantage of your rights on a daily basis. That's what was my case as a small business owner. And that's what's the case of thousands of people and hundreds of thousands of people across the country. And so I think certainly recognizing the space that the justices recognize of where litigation is going and how to protect our digital rights as well as our offline rights. I also think the lower courts are really important because as we approve appointments to all judges, a lot of times the lower courts is where folks that are working poor often have the only recourse to seek justice in smaller cases. And we cannot view the lower courts as places just to throw the book at individuals, but actually as a place to emancipate people's rights and have access to their own recourse through the law. And finally, I'm going to sort of echo what some of the folks have said. No one executive council should be a monolith in how they determine the validity or about the qualifications of the Chief Justice or any Supreme Court judge. It's really about the company you keep. And that's why I would be looking to voices like Planned Parenthood and leaders like Leah Plunkett, because they were the ones that blew the whistle on Gordon MacDonald and said, this is not someone that's going to stand up for the Constitution. This is not someone that's going to uphold Roe v. Wade. And that is so critical, not just that I may personally believe that, but so many coalitions of people can recognize when a law or a legislator or someone that's being appointed to a justice is unqualified because they won't support the Constitution. So it's not just about us as individual candidates, it's the company we keep to recognize that the courts are spaces to stand up for the have-nots, they're places to push back against big technology, to push back against corporate interests, because that's ultimately the Supreme Court is where those issues get litigated. And that's the coalition of people that I work with, folks in recovery, folks that stand up for reproductive justice, immigrants, and folks that have their rights trampled and abused because they are underrepresented and marginalized. And those are the people we need to listen to when vetting our appointments to judgeships.
Thank you. Thank you all. If you were already an executive counselor and Sununu hadn't power grabbed all the decision making over the COVID-19 CARES money earlier this year, how would you have allocated those resources differently than the governor has? Please explain. This time we'll start with Cindy, followed by Craig, Leah, and Emmett. Wait, Emmett, you were just the last one, weren't you? This time we will start with, let's see. Whose turn is it to start? I guess it's Craig's turn to start. Craig, then Leah, then, no, help me guys.
I think it's Cindy's turn to start.
I think so
Thank
too.
you very much. Okay, we will start this with Cindy. Okay. Cindy, whenever you're ready.
Sorry. So the governor has, there's so many things to do differently. Let's start with the fact that he should have gone to the fiscal committee instead of forming Gopher. And then he, usurped the power of the legislature, formed Gopher, his hand-picked group that he called bipartisan. And then when they came out with their recommendations, he picked and chose which ones he wished to follow. For instance, he told us that he would make a commitment not to close, make sure our nonprofit hospital centers don't close in this state. And yet the Gopher recommended $100 million and he gave $20 million to uphold that system. The hospitals in this state are losing $20 million a month. If you lose a hospital in your community, that is a big thing. It undermines the jobs in the community. Employers won't come to your community. So it's an important and critically important that we protect our nonprofit healthcare system. I would also not want to see funds diverted to for-profit entities when there are nonprofit providers to provide those entities. I also would not want to see monies going to people who are contributing to the governor's campaign. So in a number of ways, I would go through and redistribute the monies in a way that is more consistent with our overall our values.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Craig?
So it's not very often a state gets $1.25 billion to do what they want with. I would echo Cindy that the governor's first mistake was not in working with the fiscal committee. We would have had a very different outcome. With that said, there are some places where this money is needed. As we start getting closer to the school year opening, we need to make sure that teachers, students, cafeteria workers, bus drivers have the PPE they need, that the actual school buildings that are being used have the ventilation systems necessary, that expanded testing is available for on a regular, consistent, and easy to access basis. Then with that said, we had a real opportunity here to put money directly into the pockets of the people who need it. I'm not sure the big corporations, I'm not sure the hospital industry needed it, but working families did, I know, because I worked with constituents of mine who, when they applied for unemployment benefits, were told they could have $142 a week. Let that sink in for a minute. Nobody can live on $142 a week. So we need to expand our unemployment insurance system. We need to maintain it too, because right now the feds can't make up their mind what they're gonna do as far as that extra $600 a week goes. So those are a couple of the directions I would have gone. I also, and again, we have a real opportunity here. I would have loved to have seen some of that money set aside to fight the climate crisis. You want to stimulate the economy? Let's do it by our own miniature version of the Green New Deal right here in New Hampshire. So those are a couple of places where I would have differed with the governor. Thank you.
Me? So I think the very basis of how the spending of this funding got off to the wrong start, is that Sununu does not acknowledge that we have a broken tax and revenue structure in this state. Because when COVID hit, all of our gas money was down, all of our toll money was down, all of our meals and rentals revenue was down, all of our Keno money was down. And so that leaves property taxpayers to fund schools in a situation where they probably need more funding than ever to make sure to provide a safe and adequate education for kids. And so I think a big issue was that too much of the funding went to support typical folks in the economy, sort of average white collar workers, and didn't actually help people that were on the margins. I think not enough money went to tipped workers who weren't able to access unemployment insurance. Not enough money went to people working freelance and in the gig economy because they weren't able to demonstrate their income in the way that a lot of the systems on the Gopher Committee were vetting it through the Main Street Fund. I think too many small business owners are mom and pop shops, single member owner businesses. They lost out too because they didn't have the might and demonstration to be able to get the funds that much larger corporations got away with through this stimulus package. Oh, did that just mute me? I think that when we're looking at 2/3 of any local community paying 2/3 of its property budget on school education funding, we already have a broken system here that keeps communities like Somersworth and communities like Winchester even poorer. And this funding needs to be the beginning to shift the revenue structure to make it more equitable in our state and to make sure more people that are living and working on the margins actually have an adequate and thriving opportunity in this state.
Thank you. Leah?
Thank you. We moved really quickly when it became clear that we were getting this infusion of money into New Hampshire, and our campaign was really proud to send an open letter to the governor in early April with signatures from over 100 Granite Staters across 40 cities and towns calling on Sununu to spend the money in a way that creates a New Deal for New Hampshire. We specifically called on him to go through, as my colleagues have said, the Joint Fiscal Committee of the legislature and with the consent of the council. We called on him specifically to spend funds to make sure that funds were going directly to protect doctors, nurses, and other frontline healthcare workers, not just to hospitals, to support early childhood educators and daycare centers. He was asking to lean in at a time of deep need and to stand by businesses who were staying open or trying to redirect or scale up and pivot in the face of catastrophe. We called on him to make morally grounded stimulus spending decisions. And we're really proud that we continued that conversation with constituents throughout the spring and into the summer. We've had some Facebook Live chats with folks who have shared with everyone how this is impacting them, from parents and families who lost childcare from CFDC in Concord, which was abruptly closed under the auspices of it being pandemic related, even though it really wasn't so much. We've spoken with Ahmed Asa, who is the owner of Asa's Sweets in Concord, a Syrian immigrant who is now a US citizen who had to pivot very quickly because he lost his ability to sell the product. And we've had a lot of those other conversations, and we're going to keep having them. Counselors are supposed to be advocates for the people, and we're really proud to have been doing that, and we'll keep on doing that as it relates to getting this money spent in a morally accountable way.
Thank you all. Thank you all for that. The next question. An important role that executive counselors play is confirming non-judicial nominees, the agency department heads. How would you address a governor's nomination of an agency head? What would your considerations be? And how would you ensure that concerns over diversity are met when considering these confirmations? We will start with Craig Thompson, followed by Leah Plunkett, Emmett Soldati, and Cindy Warmington.
Thank you, Andrea. So with these types of appointments, I've already mentioned that for me, there's a litmus test. Do they believe in climate change or not? And what are they going to do about it? With that said, we've also seen with this governor, as I mentioned before, a real willingness to appoint people who simply aren't qualified. That's how we ended up with a commissioner of education who never worked in a public school. It's how we got to the place where we have a commissioner of agriculture who doesn't, for any practical purpose, believe in climate change. It's how we almost got a dentist as our poet laureate. So go figure that one out. So, you know, those to me are the two criteria, but there's one other question we have to bring up here, and that is, how do we bring diversity into state government? I think that there's a couple of pretty good examples out there. The National Football League's not a good example for much, but going on almost 20 years ago, they adopted the Rooney Rule, which simply stated that football teams, when they were hiring a head coach, had to interview minority candidates. I would like to see that we get to the place where, for these nominations, minority candidates are in the mix. That might even, to my mind, eventually mean we need to get to some sort of place where we're talking about proportional representation. If you think about proportional representation in the House of Representatives, that would mean there were 25, 30 people of color serving in the House instead of 2 or 3. So we have to actually not just pay lip service to this question of diversity, but put it into action. I would like to see lists drawn up of qualified applicants for all of these positions, and not just agency heads, but every position. I mean, there's something like 300 different boards that the Executive Council approves nominees to. Let's make sure we're including everyone. Thanks.
Thank you. I believe it's actually Emmett's turn next.
Oh, all right. Yeah, I think that when it comes to filling the many various roles, the people that execute the decisions in so many commissions, a lot of times we might assume that the specific qualifications that they have should only pertain to that particular function. And I want to talk about a specific issue that's very close to my heart. I'm in long-term recovery. I've been sober for 10 years now. And we pay a lot of lip service to recovery in this state. And yet when I look at communities over here in the Tri-City area and I talk to recovery organizations, they don't seem to think the state is doing much more. And I think representation is a big issue, because when we talk about folks with a substance use disorder, and we talk about folks that are in long-term recovery, it's not enough just to have funding or one seat at the table on the Department of Health and Human Services. Because if we're actually going to address the opioid crisis, we need folks that are in recovery on multiple boards, because it intersects with education, it intersects with public transportation and infrastructure. So I think that when we bring ourselves to decide about who's sitting on what commission and board, their lived experience matters. And so whether we're talking about folks that come from an immigrant background, folks that are in long-term recovery, folks that live in the property poorest communities of our state, their voice matters for a whole range of decisions. And I think they will actually lead us to build and make more equitable decisions to administer the affairs of our state. So certainly qualifications are important, and many of Sununu's appointments have really just been friends of his to advance his own particular political agenda. I think that's plain as day. But when we actually can get beyond it to a sensible, reasonable governor, the role of the Executive Council is to lift up voices that haven't had a seat at the table. I would be one way of representing that, so that we don't just have a Democratic majority on Executive Council in those decisions, we have a progressive majority on the Executive Council.
Thank you. Leah?
As a legal aid and consumer rights lawyer, and now as an educator who is a member of the NEA, and also our campaign has been endorsed by the NEA, as well as a former Planned Parenthood and current ACLU trustee, I take a lot of pride, and it's a real source of integrity for me to have always been on the front lines, never in the back rooms. And I agree that we have a governor who has been doing cronyism and has been giving us appointees who are not competent, let alone courageous. And it's crucial that counselors bring their lived experience, I agree, and the experiences of their constituents to ensuring that every nominee is competent, ideally courageous, and has a perspective that takes into account the needs of all of the constituencies that they will be serving in that role. And as a counselor, I would stand firm with nominees, as I did on the Gordon McDonald nomination, to ensure that we have competent and ideally courageous nominees across the board. I think it's crucial that we have a inclusive, equitable, forward-looking approach to what we see as relevant qualifications. You know, as someone who's a full-time working mom of young kids, actually I can relate to what Emmett said in his opening. You know, we get told a lot in this state that, you know, if you're busy starting a business here, raising kids here, working a job here, leave the decision making to other people. We can't do that. And we need to make sure, whether it is along lines of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, family status, geography, religion, and so on, that we are not sticking with a one-size-fits-all, outdated, stodgy approach to what counts as a qualification.
Thank you. And Cindy?
Thank you. So this gets back to the transformational vision of the Executive Council that I've been talking about. And that is, we can talk all we want about what we want to see in nominees. But when we get to the Executive Council, it's the governor that makes the nominations. And the Executive Council can vet them. And I would be vetting them for competence and to make sure that they believe in the mission of the agency that they are going to serve. We have to have a commissioner of education that believes in public education. We have to have a commissioner of environmental services, a commissioner of agriculture that believes in climate change. I believe it has to be that way. But I think that the critical point is, how are we going to affect this from the role of the Executive Council? And this, to me, what we can do is we can be out in our communities and working with stakeholders from all different constituencies to identify candidates and bring them forward and make those recommendations publicly, so that we are bringing that diversity and that panel before the governor. And he may reject them over and over again, but that is how we are going to shine light on the fact that his nominations are not competent, they are not diverse, is that we will keep on raising that issue up and shining light on it. One of the things that few people know is that one of the things the governor is doing in his role is not always filling positions, because he either wants to have a holdover or he doesn't like the person who would be destined to hold that position due to their position in a particular organization. So we need to be watchdogs of him. Understanding the role of the Executive Council and how you can push the power of the Executive Council is critical here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Now, this portion of our candidate conversation is over. And now we will turn it over to our organizing director to take a question from the audience.
Hey everyone, Isaac Grimm here, organizing director with Rights and Democracy. Pronouns are he and him. Thank you to everyone who's here and to all the candidates for your thoughtful responses so far. Want to just, I've been tracking the chat and appreciate everyone just being so engaged, bringing up some really good points of information, asking some good questions. I think some of the questions have been, addressed through the prepared questions. One point of information brought forward by Carlos Cardona was that there are in fact 2 parole officers that are of color within New Hampshire. So that being said, 2 out of 64 is still absolutely woefully inadequate. And there's a massive amount of work for us to do in New Hampshire to address racial bias, racial inequity, and the way it plays out economically, culturally, in our education system, in so many facets of our economy and our society. Something I wanted to bring up that was a question brought forward by a few folks that was specifically for Emmett, but I think this can actually connect to all the candidates in a bit of a similar way. So Emmett spoke in favor of raising the minimum wage to $12 an hour last year, wrote an op-ed on it, testified at the State House, spoke at a press conference. So the question from the audience was, as a business owner yourself, were you providing that wage of $12 an hour to your employees? And then to try to have this be something that all of us can respond to across the candidates is, Craig, you mentioned in your website that as a farmer, you pay your workers livable wages. So if you could specify what that means to you, what it is that you provide to your employees. And then for Cindy and Leah, if there have been times when you in your legal profession have been working with contractors or employees, how have you advocated for livable wages? And if you could explain that, that would be super helpful. So why don't we start with Emmett, and then we'll pass it to Craig, then Cindy, then Leah.
Yeah, thanks, Isaac, and thanks for the question. And it definitely speaks to why it's so important to have small businesses at the table when we talk about raising the wage, because I do support it and it is incredibly important. And I also have the lived experience of running and starting and running and building a restaurant in one of the poorest cities in our state. And it took me 9 years to be able to pay a living wage. So today we pay, I think the lowest wage on staff is $15 an hour. I certainly hope to be able to maintain that post-COVID. But of course it hasn't always been that way. I mean, certainly starting out when I had one other staffer, I raised $5,000 and I paid whatever I thought I could. There wasn't any take-home pay for me. And I very quickly learned a valuable lesson, that your people are the only key to your success as a business. And though there are many factors working against a restaurant in a small, sleepy community that claims to be very loud and LGBTQ, at the end of the day, you need to provide for your workers. And so I have worked as hard as I can over the last several years to increase wages, increase any types of perks to make a cafe like Teetotaler exist. But at the end of the day, the reason I can't have the types of margins and pay the incredible types of wages in the early days that I wanted to is too many of my customers aren't making a livable wage. And so the whole goal of raising the wage legislation and why we need small business owners at the table is because it's to our benefit and our advantage that if we can't expect one restaurant to go alone, one individual business to go alone, we need to help all boats float in a rising tide. And that improves my local economy. And it's a mandate to keep more money locally so that the corporations down the street, the Dunkin' Donuts of the world, they have to pay a higher wage to their workers too, and not send the corporate profits back to headquarters. So when I wrote the article, our sort of overall tip to minimum wage was 11, and then we moved it up to 12 for full-timers, and we've continued, and I'm grateful to be able to get to a space that has some health benefits and $15 an hour. But there's more work to do, and we shouldn't put it on the backs of individual small business owners. We need the legislation passed.
Thank you, Emmett. Craig?
So I would preface my answer with this reality. As a legislator, one of the real issues I have with what I would call the Democratic establishment, Democratic leadership, is that in the House, we were told we should support a minimum wage bill that went to $12 an hour. We were told we should do that because the governor might sign it. Well, we've all seen how that worked out. And the idea that even $15 an hour is realistic is simply aiming too low. If we really want to move the goalposts on this, we have to aim higher. We have to say, people need a living wage. Think how the current economic landscape during this pandemic would look. It would be drastically different if, in fact, people were making a real living before the pandemic. A big part of resilience is being able to set some money aside. So with that said, on the farm, one of the things that's hard is that we're not competing on a level playing field. We pay a wage that is a living wage. Now, are we a huge corporation with hundreds of employees? No, I have one full-time year-round guy, and his package is equivalent to $26 an hour. And I'm very pleased to be able to provide him with that job. And I would rather pay him that job than two people 13. Thanks.
Thank you, Craig. Cindy.
Thank you. I am also a small business owner as a partner at Shaheen & Gordon, but we have been committed to making sure that we do not lay off any staff. We have not cut any hours. We have worked very hard to protect our staff throughout this COVID crisis. But I think there's another example that everyone on this call could answer to, and that is, how are you paying your campaign staff? I am paying my campaign staff as a W-2 employee. All of my employees are W-2 employees, and they have unemployment, they have workers' compensation, and they are paid the minimum wage that I'm paying to a staffer is $15 an hour. So putting your money where your mouth is, and you can see that by looking at my campaign finance reports, because I have filed in the most transparent way that you can file, by using the Secretary of State's website, by filing as a candidate committee. And there's only one other person, Leah, on this call who can say that. But I am paying fair wages. I am also have paid my employee a stipend to make sure that she can purchase health insurance on the exchange. And so every one of us can look and see there are two other candidates, unfortunately, on this call who chose to file as candidates instead of candidate committees. And so you cannot see how their money is spent, you cannot see what they've raised, and you cannot see what's been spent until just before the election. So I would advocate for transparency and for payment of a living wage.
Thank you, Cindy. That's time. Leah, go ahead.
So in my role as a union member and educator, I've actually been through the collective bargaining process. My position at University of New Hampshire went through a contested PELRB hearing, Public Employee Labor Relations Board. I showed up and I testified on the record in a way against my immediate supervisor and the dean, not in a mean-spirited or hostile way, but it's very uncomfortable to be seated across the room, from the folks who are controlling the terms and conditions of your employment, and having to stand up, even with the amazing backing of the NEA. And I was, very pregnant at the time with one kid at home. And the university system actually took my position all the way up to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And the NEA got a victory for me and for my colleagues. And so I have lived experience with being part of a collective bargaining process to determine my compensation and my terms and conditions of employment. And in terms of campaign staff, yes, my committee has filed with full, most transparent disclosure. I have one full-time staffer. She is a rock star. She's somewhere on this call. We properly pay her as an independent contractor because she has this whole time and still has some other clients that she works with. So that is the appropriate, mutually agreed upon designation. Thank
you, Leah. So there's some great back and forth in the chat. I would encourage folks to just follow along with some of the back and forth there, points of information being shared. We were originally hoping to do this in an hour, and then in the last few days we've been like, this is going to have to go until at least 15 minutes after. So we really need to kind of bring it to a close here. I really appreciate everyone for your really thoughtful questions in the chat. If any of the candidates are willing to share your contact information with any of the folks who have asked questions, if you want to be able to follow up, please do so. And with that, I will pass it back to my friend and colleague, Asma Alhouni, who's gonna close us out tonight. Let me make sure that Asma can get unmuted here. You good, Asma?
Yes, I'm good. Wow, what a night, y'all. What a night. Rights and Democracy wants to thank everyone for joining us today and for learning about the candidates. It's one seat, the Democratic nominee for the Executive Council District 2 race. And we want to thank the candidates for, one, stepping up to run for office, but also your very thoughtful answers to our questions, and also the commitment you have to make New Hampshire an equitable state. So thank you so much. I want to thank our moderator, Andrea Palizas, for moderating the forum and asking amazing questions. So thank you, Andrea. And all the candidates who joined us this evening, they all filled out these forms for Rights and Democracy. And if you want to help us figure out who among these wonderful candidates that we will endorse as RAD, you can be a part of that process. So if you go to the chat and click on the link that should be there hopefully now, you can become a member. And when you become a member, you can help us vote for which candidate to endorse for this Executive Council District 2 race. And if you become a member, you can also vote for other candidates for many other critical races in New Hampshire as well. So definitely become a member. We are going to declare who we endorse, I believe, in the weekend, by the weekend. So you need to become a member as soon as possible. I believe the deadline is tomorrow to vote for this particular endorsement. So definitely do that as soon as possible. Also, make sure you follow Rights and Democracy on Facebook and become a supporter and a member. Again, clicking on the link. And we're going to have other events that we're going to organize for the lead up to the September 8th primaries and also the November 3rd general election. So until our next event, thank you so much, everyone, for coming out, the candidates, the help. And I also want to put out a shout out to Isaac, who's in the background and doing all the, the technical stuff. So thank you so much. And Isaac is our director for organizing, community organizing. So thanks so much, Isaac. So until next time, thank you so much and have a great evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, everyone.